Winnipeg's offseason has generally been pretty okay so far. The Jets have taken care of business. They've made the trades and signings that they needed to, and they have most of their affairs in order. But for the upcoming season, right, I've been pretty positive about it, and yet I've still got three things that have me slightly concerned about how the Jets are going to fare in this upcoming season. We'll dive into all of those on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. But more than anything else, we just really love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode is brought to you by Bird Dogs. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNHL or enter promo code LockedOnNHL at checkout for a free white tech hat with any order. You won't want to take your bird dogs off, we promise you. Now, like I said at the top of the episode, obviously the Jets have had quite an offseason. Some parts are rather good and some parts maybe a little bit questionable, but obviously as the Jets have kind of made some adjustments up front and tweaked a few things with some of the signings and contracts, Winnipeg, I would say, is in decent shape, right, for the upcoming season. But there are still a couple of questions that I would say I have about this team going forward. And I think the three main questions that I have concern kind of the stuff around the roster, right? The first big question that I have is, how are the Jets going to handle injuries? I think the Jets' injury depth this year is a little bit on the middling side, right? Winnipeg, if you're looking at the starting lineup, it's pretty good. Vilardi, Perfetti, Scheifele, Hellebuyck, Morrissey, you name it, the Jets have a pretty nice top nine and a relatively functional defense with a pretty strong goaltending duo in the back end. But if anyone gets hurt, Winnipeg starts to find itself running into some very early issues. If it's a player in the third or fourth lines, Winnipeg does have a couple of options internally to replace them. But if you look at, say, Scheifele or Perfetti or any of those guys, if they get hurt, Winnipeg immediately starts to find itself in trouble. And that's okay, right? That's pretty normal for most teams. But I think with Winnipeg, unlike a lot of other teams that can kind of shift pieces around and stuff, this team doesn't quite have the same flexibility if somebody really crucial goes down. Now, I will say the addition of Iafallo and Vilardi changes that slightly this season over last, but I still feel that, generally speaking, the Jets lack a lot of injury insurance, which, again, like I said, is not that uncommon. I think where it becomes an issue for the Jets is that it could seriously, put a dent in Winnipeg's ability to keep pace throughout the season. And I don't know that it's necessarily going to happen this year. I mean, again, I'm talking about like worst case scenario stuff, right? Overall, I think the Jets are going to have a pretty strong year. But I think, there are, again, a couple of nightmare scenarios where you start to ask some questions. You start to get a little bit nervous. If Ehlers goes down again for like half the season, how will the Jets manage? I still think they can kind of get away without him for part of the year. But what he does in transition, how he can improve power plays, all of that stuff is really crucial. And so for me, him, Scheifele, Perfetti, those guys are players that the Jets really just can't afford to lose this year. One on its own would be bad enough, but like 2+ would be kind of disastrous. The Jets have survived injuries before, but I kind of wonder if they're going to be able to do that again, especially if the Central Division is a tougher place and the rest of the league has made some pretty big moves to try and shift the balance of power around. So a lot of things to consider, but I do kind of wonder if the Jets have, internally options that they feel they're really comfortable with. This would be a good time to kind of take advantage of some of the ELCs or some of the young talents the Jets have picked up and maybe give them an early, run throughout, maybe a couple of games here and there if somebody gets injured or if somebody just needs a rest, rotate some of your players in and give them a nice NHL paycheck for a couple of games and also see maybe, they're closer to the NHL than they appear. Guys like, Harkins, Reichel, Torgerson, these are players that could potentially play a role for the Jets. Harkins has in the past, Reichel has in a very limited sample, and Torgerson has yet to make his NHL debut, but might this season, pending how things go. Obviously, Torgerson's a little bit further off in my mind, I feel like, in terms of what I was hoping he'd do with the Moose. He hasn't quite hit that level yet, but, I'm going to be patient with him. He can at least still play with Manitoba for a while, and he seems like he's a fun enough player who's got solid skating for his size. But in terms of like Harkins and Reichel, obviously we know that they can slot right into the middle six and probably be pretty decent. So, I guess for me, my question is, are the Jets comfortable with this roster as is? The defense, I think you could probably call upon a Logan Stanley or something like that if somebody gets injured. Capobianco's still around. But, generally speaking, I just feel a little bit ambivalent, right? Like I said, I'm still a little bit nervous. The Jets have weathered injuries before, like I've said, but I kind of wonder how many times they can escape that. Again, with a league that's tough and with a Jets team that, quite frankly, had a lot of trouble scoring goals last year. And if any of their key goal scorers goes injured for a long period of time this year, it's going to put a dent in Winnipeg. So let's hope the Jets stay healthy. I think that would be the most ideal situation. And maybe the Jets have one or two more moves in store for us. But, as it is right now, the Jets have a really strong starting lineup. I just hope it can stay healthy and make it through to the end of the year. Now, I guess the second big concern that I have is a very obvious one because we've spent a lot of time talking about it. But I think for me, it kind of points to the longer-term issue with the team and what it says about the direction and leadership that the Jets are currently following. We'll talk about why it bothers me still in just a little bit. But before we go any further, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at Bird Dogs. Bird Dogs are the only pair of pants that make you feel and look good. They're made with great stretchy materials that, not only hug you a little bit tighter, but also give you a nice sculpted look. It also uses anti-stink sweat wicking fabric, so no matter what you're up to, you can be assured that, the sensitive areas down south don't smell like it. And of course, it's comfortable, it's cool, and again, like I said, stretches to fit you just right. Bird Dogs has been described as like a bit like Lululemon, but it's even more comfortable, and it has plenty of different styles and options for you should you want to hit the greens or maybe just go out with some friends. They've got great shorts, long pants. No matter what, Bird Dogs has one just for you. So if you're ready to give Bird Dogs a shot, go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNHL or enter promo code LockedOnNHL at checkout for a free white tech hat with any order. That's birddogs.com/LockedOnNHL or again, promo code LockedOnNHL at checkout for a free white tech hat. You won't want to take your Bird Dogs off, we promise you. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for joining us in tonight's episode as we are talking about a couple of big concerns heading into the upcoming season. Now, I'm not going to say that I'm super worried about next year overall. I think the Jets are going to have a strong year, but I suppose my concerns not only, encompass the present, but also the longer-term future of the team. And the Scheifele and Hellebuyck question is pretty much the biggest elephant in the room. The Jets don't really seem to know quite what they're going to do with either of these guys. There's been a lot of speculation from the media, which I think is hinting that the Jets are intending to maybe keep both. And if that's the case, obviously the Jets are going to have to figure out towards the trade deadline if either is really worth keeping for the rest of the season or if they should be sent on to greener pastures. And over the course of the past few months, I think the biggest thing that's become clear is that the market for both players is kind of up and down, right? Scheifele could probably still get an okay trade package. Hellebuyck, maybe not. And I think the other concern for Helly is that, when it comes to his own contract extensions, teams seem very wary of handing out big money to goalies, especially guys in his age bracket. So Helly might have to adjust his own expectations for what he's going to get out of this. And maybe, all signs point to him thinking about a return to the Jets. That's kind of hypothetical, but, should he not really see better offers elsewhere, Helly might be better served just hanging out in Winnipeg. Obviously, the Jets have their own issues, and they're not a perfect team. I've talked at length about a lot of the decision making that's kind of thrown me for a loop. But overall, right, you look at the prospect pool, you look at the current veterans, you look at the situation the Jets are in, and there's some reason to be optimistic that maybe, just maybe, they're starting to go into a better direction. But that kind of takes me to my main concern that I have with all of this, right? I think for me, this trade situation is kind of emblematic of a larger issue with the direction the Jets are trying to take. And I've talked about it before, but the main thing that I'm concerned about is that Winnipeg is so focused on the present that at times they don't always uh, have the greatest handle on the future. And it's not like the Jets haven't worked themselves out of a pinch before. I think we've seen it with the Trouba trade when they were, backed against a wall. They did the same thing with Evander Kane. But how many times can you escape, situations where you're going to lose assets for nothing? And I don't know that it's necessarily the same situation with Scheifele and Hellebuyck, but I do feel like, in terms of both players, they've kind of expressed dissatisfaction with Winnipeg. The Jets at times have expressed dissatisfaction with them, more on Scheifele's end than Hellebuyck's end. But at the end of the day, it's still kind of a business. And I think the Jets really need to be clear about how they're going to approach this season. I think, after this year, you really are starting to count down, Kyle Connor's contract, Nikolai Ehlers' contract. I don't really know that they have a clear answer as to whether they're extending both of those guys. I feel like I would love for Ehlers to come back. I don't know how I feel about KFC as much as I enjoy watching him. I feel like there's so many unknowns, and the future for the Jets is really going to be, again, back to the drawing board with draft and develop, because, in the past, the Jets used to do that, and then they stopped graduating prospects, and now we have an aging, underperforming core that's really struggled to live up to expectations. So all of this to say, the I guess the final decision that the Jets make with both Hellebuyck and Scheifele is going to be really critical to how the Jets see the future. Because if they trade both players mid-season or even before the start, it does kind of mean that the Jets are expecting, maybe a bit of a soft retool or a rebuild. But if they don't, if they're still so focused on, playoff revenue and stuff, that's going to be a troubling sign. I think the more that the Jets focus on trying to put butts in seats immediately, the worse it's going to mean some of these moves are. Like, are the Jets going to sell off futures to try and bring in big talents? Probably not. At least I hope not. But, are they going to make desperation moves and maybe bring in somebody who's not really a great fit for the roster? That could be a legitimate concern and something that I hope they avoid. I guess the flip side that's positive about this is that, generally speaking, the Jets haven't done this kind of stuff. In fact, they're almost notorious for not making moves. So you can probably rest assured that unless it's a really good deal, the Jets are not super interested. But if it does happen to be a really fairly priced asset or something, or maybe even a slightly more expensive asset that's only a little bit of an overpay, the Jets might spring for it. And sometimes they've brought in players that I didn't really feel added to the team in a meaningful way. But yeah, the Scheifele and Hellebuyck thing, kind of just hanging out there really puts the Jets in a bind because they can't decide what they're going to do with the rest of the roster. It, forces them to kind of ask some questions about the long-term future of the team. It forces them to, set up contingency plans ahead of the start of the season. And it makes tactical planning really difficult. It makes, long-term roster projections challenging. So I hope that they can resolve this question sooner rather than later. The more that they push this off, the worse it's going to be. And I think, for Scheifele, he needs the change of scenery. Hellebuyck, I would still like to have around, but obviously, like I said on the previous episode, if he stays, it does mean that it's going to be a lot harder to get a top draft pick, if not impossible almost, because Helly just doesn't really have bad years. So, yeah, a lot to chew on, a lot for the Jets front office to chew on, but hopefully they can kind of showcase a good vision for the future. Obviously, I really enjoyed the prospect focus that they've had recently. I like that they're talking about guys with high character, but I need a little bit more, right? As a fan, I still feel like there's something kind of missing for me that I'm waiting for them to show us, but in due time. I only have one more question, I suppose, that I think is really worth talking about, and it kind of relates to this one about Scheifele and Hellebuyck, if more tangentially. We'll talk about, this question of, is this it for this Jets offseason in just a little bit? Hello, friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts in tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you for joining us on these final thoughts in tonight's show. I just thought I wanted to spend a few minutes briefly chatting about a big question that I have for this Jets offseason, and that is this it? I sort of hinted at it at right before the break. Are the Jets done making moves? And I know that sounds kind of silly, but it I feel a little bit ungrateful here because the Jets did really well with the Dubois trade, maybe one of the best trades of the entire offseason. By the same token, though, the Jets still have quite a bit of work to do, not just signing some free agents, but also trying to fix the back end. I still think the defense is 1 to 2 pieces away from being at a level where I'd feel comfortable with it. I mean, it's okay now, but it's not great. And the stuff that we saw last year where Hellebuyck got scored on because there was 1 or 2 critical mistakes that he really couldn't stop. I mean, the Jets kind of put him under some really high pressure situations. I feel like, the Jets didn't give up a lot, but when they did give up something, it was almost a guaranteed goal for the opponent, unless Hellebuyck did his Houdini trick and stole it out of midair or something. But yeah, I mean, I just feel like the Jets could still make some moves, but by the same token, until they figure out what's going on with Hellebuyck and Scheifele, they are kind of handcuffed. I feel like they're not going to make any major adjustments until they have a firm decision either way on both 55 and 37, because with both players, an extension comes with pretty big cap considerations. I still feel like Scheifele is not going to be a Jet for the entire year, whether it's the season or the calendar year. I just suspect that, Mark is going to be on his way out at some point. If not sometime this season, then maybe next summer when he's a free agent. I feel like there's just too much bad blood between him and Winnipeg, and I'm sure the Jets would probably prefer to trade him first. But, if he doesn't really feel like the front office is giving him what he wants, if he doesn't feel like he's got that vision and the leadership that he expects from the front office and the coaching staff, I just don't think he's going to want to stick around. Hellebuyck might be a little bit easier to sway just because the market for his services right now isn't great to begin with, and he's settled in Winnipeg. He's got kids. This might be a place where he kind of, decides to really, I wouldn't say become a full career Jet, but as close to something that, like that as you probably get, especially considering this next contract would basically be his last huge extension. So, yeah, Winnipeg, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about this offseason. There's a lot that I like, but there are some pieces where I'm still concerned enough about it to feel like the Jets really need to do a couple of other major things. And it's strange to say that because the Jets have already done some really big freaking moves. But until they kind of solve the defense and figure out Mark and Helly, I just don't know what the season's going to hold for us. I think it'll be more fun on the one hand. I do think it's going to be entertaining. But on the other hand, it's going to come at some kind of a cost. And whether the Jets feel it this year or sometime 3 to 4 years down the road, I couldn't tell you. All I know is that the Jets have a fair bit of business to get through. And as a fan, it's been weird, right? You kind of feel like you're stuck in limbo, waiting for something to happen, hoping that the Jets announce some kind of a major move. But so far, it's been radio silence. I mean, even the media is dead quiet around the Jets. And you wouldn't really expect that for a team that's got 2 of its superstar players tentatively on the trading block. But until the Jets really firm up a decision either way, it's just been a little bit alarming to see how little movement there's been. At least we can get excited about Brad Lambert and Rucker McGroarty, guys like that. I think the future for this team is certainly looking up, but the present is definitely at least a little bit concerning. I'd be curious to know what you're worried about heading into this next season. Is it, Mark and Helly at the top of it? Do you have other concerns? Maybe you might even be concerned about the special teams and power play because of how big of an issue it's been the past couple of years. Do you think that's enough to sink the team? Drop your thoughts and concerns in the comment section below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. But for tonight's show, that is going to be all the time that we have. Thanks so much for listening and making us your first listen of the day. We will see you here next week, hopefully, with a wonderful interview with Mike Ranica from The Devil Wears Prada. But like I said, for tonight's show, that's all the time that we have. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great night, and go Jets go.